Hello, and welcome to RPGMD, a resource dedicated to writing you a prescription for all things dice, dragons, and gaming. Now, Dungeons & Dragons is a game that is full of different racial options, from your classical elves and dwarves to more wild things like the turtle or the Arakoa. But there is one racial option that is often forgotten by players and dungeon masters alike. It's a little bit of a darker option, actually, and should really only be looked at for players that either want to play an evil character or are merely so obsessed with power that they're willing to do anything for it. And that is the option of a vampire variant. Satan spawn, creatures of the night, or maybe just a human infected with rabies, vampires have gone by many, many names, and for being as popular as they are in pop culture, it's no surprise to find them in Dungeons & Dragons. They can make wonderful villains complete with their own complex motivations, desires, or even backstories, all while creating a darker tone for the setting. Or maybe perhaps the Dungeon Master has just watched Twilight one too many times recently. However, what happens when a player themselves wants to become a vampire, and is this even possible in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition? In this video, we're going to look at the few very specific rules 5th edition has for player character vampires, and also look at a more balanced kind of homebrew option that we'll go into a little bit more later. A fitting start for a video about vampires is a discussion of how exactly are people turned into vampires in the Dungeons & Dragons universe. And there's the very obvious kind of out-of-game reasoning, which is a player just starting the game saying, I want to play a vampire character. And while that kind of works, a player should also at least have a small backstory explaining how they got turned, as no one is just born a vampire. To do this, there are a couple different ways, namely two, that a player can be turned into a vampire. The first is that when attacked by a vampire, if a player dies, they can be turned into a vampire spawn, which is kind of a lesser vampire creature that still has a bloodlust and is kind of less powerful than your average true vampire. They are under the complete control of a vampire, and thus if a player is turned into a vampire spawn in a fight with a vampire, they would lose control of their players and become more of a mindless monster. However, you can break this control by what is more likely in a band of murder hobos, by destroying the true vampire, or what is better for an overall story and kind of progressive narrative, which is that the vampire lets the vampire spawn drink his own blood, turning that person into a true vampire, while still having their maker around for more story beats later. Now, in terms of a historical perspective, vampires have obviously been around in Dungeons & Dragons since the very first edition, with editions 1 through 3.5 having more than 25 different variants of vampires in them. However, it wasn't until 4th edition that player characters were able to become vampires themselves. And in 4th edition, there was an entire class called the vampire class, rather than a racial option. 5th edition is actually the first edition to introduce some kind of mechanics in terms of player characters becoming a vampire, though it is, like I said, just a very small section and is by no means a full kind of racial choice, which makes sense considering you still have a race that you were originally before you became a vampire anyways. Now let's dive into the real meat of this video, which is how do mechanically player characters as vampires work in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. So the only real information we have for this comes out of page 295 of the Monster Manual of all places. Under the Vampire Monster section, there's a small blurb about player characters becoming vampires in 5th edition, in which it states that when a player character is turned into a vampire, none of their previous statistics are affected at all, actually, except for a couple of bonuses. Now, first, all their strength, constitution, and dexterity scores increase to 18 if they are not already higher. The player characters also gain resistance to necrotic damage, but also bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage from all things that are not magical weapons. They get 120-foot dark vision, and additionally receive all of the different abilities and traits that the vampire has listed in the Monster Manual, which include things such as polymorphing into a bat or a cloud of mist. They get the ability to misty step back to their coffin when they're reduced to 0 hit points. They have a permanent regeneration and spider climb, in addition to a bunch of other unique attacks, etc. However, it's not all good things that you inherit when you become a vampire. Becoming a player character vampire also gives you the weaknesses of a vampire, which includes some things that are obvious, which is damage when you're in direct sunlight, kind of similar to how drow characters work. You cannot move through running water as it is basically acid to you, and you cannot enter anyone's home unless you are invited, so a vampire thief would be pretty hard to play. And if all that wasn't enough, your character is now considered undead, making Radiant do double damage to them, and additionally, your alignment will shift to a lawful evil without question, which can be extremely difficult for player characters to play off the cuff, as it can be a huge change for their character. So looking at all of this, I think it's pretty safe to say that becoming a vampire as a player character is pretty overpowered with what we're given in 5th edition so far. If you give one of your players this, the other players are going to quickly feel underpowered by comparison, in addition to being crippled by basically only going out at night from now on. In addition to this, as I stated before, this is a large role-playing burden to place on your character, as they can't simply ignore the fact that they are now an evil creature. It actually states in the monster manual that basically all positive emotions are twisted and turned on themselves. Love is turned to obsession, friendship to jealousy, and they've basically given up all means to happiness for pure power. Because of this, I think that vampire creatures are better used as a way to let an NPC exit from a campaign, or really to turn a player character into an NPC if a player is leaving the party for good, and maybe this player character can keep coming back through the story as they are now an undead creature. In addition to this, this allows you to take one player character, turn them into an NPC, and have them be in your campaign for years, as even if you skip time ahead, there's no reason that a vampire can't still be around hundreds of years from now. The monster manual actually even supports the idea of a player becoming an NPC through this, as it states in the small blurb that we do get for vampire player characters that the Dungeon Master can take control of the player character at any time. So I know what you're all thinking. RPGMD, so you're saying you basically just made a video about a racial variant that you don't even recommend playing? And yeah, I kind of did. But I will offer you an alternative that is a much more balanced option, and that is the Dampier race. The Dampier race is actually a mixture or a union between a human and a vampire, and creates what is kind of a mixture of the two. In their human side, they do not need to feast on others for blood, and appear very human in nature, albeit a little more beautiful. In their vampire kind of characteristics, they still have sunlight sensitivity, and the ability to bite and charm others, though they don't require this to live. They are kind of similar statistically to a drow, and have the same weakness in terms of the sunlight, in addition to kind of flavor variant powers. I see this as a much more balanced option for parties. If someone really wants to play a kind of vampire person, they'll still get the ability to bite, they could drink blood if they really want to, but they can be of any alignment, and don't have overpowered strength statistics that everyone's going to hate them for. I will, of course, include a description to the homebrew link down below, and it'll be up to you and your Dungeon Master to see if they allow something like this at your table. And then it's actually going to wrap up our video on a vampire racial option in 5th edition. Obviously, I think there's a lot more to be talked about with vampires in this, including the possibility of a future vampire class, considering that it was found in 4th edition's Heroes of Shadows book. If you have any great vampire stories, I would love to hear about them in the comments below in your Dungeons & Dragons campaigns. As always, please feel free to like, favorite, and subscribe. You'd be doing me a big favor. And you can catch links to my previous videos over here and over here. As always, I am RPGMD, writing your prescription on all things dice, dragons, and gaming. See you guys next week.